A smart community is one that is ultimately tools in the hands of users. I mean, perhaps I would look at examples of what Barcelona has tried to do with Decidem, where you're trying to actually give tools to people to allow them to participate in their lives more and to connect to cities and government, but in a way that allows them to do so within the confines of their daily life. In the sense of we all have a job, we're all struggling under late capitalism. How do you ease the friction that would allow me to participate more fully in that versus adding a whole other layer of friction on top of it?
Hi, Smart Community friends. It's Ellen Ronalds-Keane here, the producer of the Smart Community podcast, just filling in for Zoe in this intro. In this episode of the Smart Community podcast, Zoe has a fascinating conversation with Greg Lindsay. Greg is a journalist, urbanist, futurist and speaker, and senior fellow for Applied Research and Foresight in New Cities in Montreal, Canada. In this episode, Greg begins by telling us about his background in journalism and covering the dot-com bubble 20 years ago, how he dates the beginning of smart cities, and he shares with us his journey to working in the smart cities space. Zoe and Greg discuss in length some of the common and most effective smart community themes that they find help build better communities, and Greg then shares a bit about some of the projects he has been working on. Zoe and Greg finish their chat discussing the emerging trends of augmented reality and what this can potentially mean for our communities. As always, we hope you enjoy listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
Welcome to the smart community, smart regions, smart towns, and smart cities. It's where we live, work, and play. With smart communities, the future starts today. Big data, smart mobility, emerging trends galore. The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.
Well, hello, Greg. Thank you for coming on to the Smart Community Podcast. I am so happy to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Well, let's just jump straight in. And can you tell us about your background and what you're passionate about?
Oh, where to start? So I'm Greg Lindsay. I am the senior fellow for Applied Research and Foresight at New Cities here in Montreal. I'm here in Canada. I'm an American who immigrated a few years ago, which perhaps we could touch upon that because it does definitely relate to the future of cities and climate and many things. And my background, I'm a journalist. I started covering the dot-com bubble 20 years ago, which has a lot actually of lessons to apply to so-called smart cities or how they've evolved today. And then, through various detours, I wrote a book about the future of cities, globalization, and air travel called Aerotropolis. And it's been like a decade of smart cities ever since. So the last thing I'll note is I've been covering smart cities since the beginning, and I would date the beginning to the speech that the CEO of IBM gave to the Council on Foreign Relations in the fall of 2008, where they unveiled Smarter Planet. And that was the moment where the big tech companies went from like smart homes and figuring out how are we going to sell this stuff to let's sell it to governments instead on the eve of the financial crisis. So that's where I got into this.
I am very excited to have that conversation with you. And I think what are we now? 2022. So much has changed, but there's all these things that are the same as well. So I'm excited to jump into that. So let's start broad and tell us how you came to be in this space. Other than covering, you're covering the dot-com bubble, the start of smart cities, what kind of kept you to coming back to this conversation?
Well, I would consider myself an urbanist, which I also love as a word that's basically meaningless. If you love cities, you're an urbanist. But, what brings me back to it is that, cities is where I think I wrote in my book, like city is where globalization is made flesh. Like all of the systems, financialization, logistics, transport, all of it, they are made literally concrete in the form of cities. And so therefore, it's like the perfect site to understand everything, like how we live, climate change, all this sort of discussion. So that's how I keep coming back to it in various forms. And again, from like the smart city discussion, like that got started as a way, of technology companies, which here we are, more than a decade later, nearly a decade and a half later, where tech companies have more power than ever over our lives due to the pandemic and how they were turbocharged. And, with software having eaten the world, they're now coming for the world itself. And, and so therefore, I guess how my perspective has changed over time is I've become arguably more radicalized. I've become, having seen through the various false promises and failed delivery on the ones they actually did intend to keep. It's become more incumbent than ever that we see through like the smart city, which is I think a very much a poison phrase, and bring it back around to the sort of more bottom up notion of, are there models of technology empowering communities? And that's the work I'm trying to do now with the MIT Future Urban Collectives Lab, led by my friend Rafi Siegel.
So before we dive into that too, let's go, what is a smart community to you?
That's a great question. I would look at, for example, a smart community is one that is ultimately tools in the hands of users. Perhaps I would look at examples of what Barcelona has tried to do with Decidem, where you're trying to actually give tools to people to allow them to participate in their lives more and to connect to cities and government, but in a way that allows them to do so within the confines of their daily life. In the sense of, we all have a job, we're all struggling under late capitalism. How do you ease the friction that would allow me to participate more fully in that versus adding a whole other layer of friction on top of it? And so Barcelona is one example. I'm working with a group, on this MIT project with a group out of Bilbao called Discos, Distributed Cooperatives. They're trying to basically put a positive spin on all this Web3 scamware that's come out of it. And, they're working with groups like Cooperation Jackson in Mississippi, which is a Black collective, co-op collective. And so how do you create tools for that community that allows them to organize, to more easily fund themselves, to create community initiatives? And I think there's a whole lot of that. It's, we could look at the co-op movement, we could look at the municipalist movement, all these sort of bottom-up burblings. How do we create a tech layer that enables them to activate community resources and attention?
Yeah, I like that. And I think just before we hit record, talking about moving from that and not just the conversation, but the action, right? It's all well and good to say we're about the people and we're going to do this, but unless you actually dive in and act on that, and sometimes those things aren't sexy, right? They're not sexy like a new widget or whatever we want, an autonomous vehicle, but it's actually about real community engagement and tools, right?
No, totally. I would say that, the greatest example of a smart community that popped up globally, and I've said it a little, I wish I could spend more time. We go back to March 2020. The idea of mutual aid is an idea that's 100 years old conceptually. And in the United States, there are examples like the Black Panther Party in the 60s. And then after disasters, Hurricane Katrina in 2005, Hurricane Sandy in 2012, you have Occupy Sandy, groups that were using physical locations of communities and digital tools like Google Docs, whatever happened to be lying around. And then in March 2020, due to various stay-at-home orders, suddenly you have thousands of parallel mutual aid groups that are meeting virtually because that's the only way they could, and organizing to help elderly neighbors, to help people get food, to get medicine. And it's still sort of a squandered moment because governments didn't know how to figure it out. These groups arose because governments failed and the markets failed. But that's a perfect example of people just using Slack and Airtable and just phone numbers and Facebook groups. And to me, there's arguably a missed opportunity there in the sense of no one's really developed the tools that would really accentuate those groups. People just grab whatever they could possibly find. And that speaks a lot to how software is made and some of the problems there. But that's a great example of that, of this incredible pent up energy, and people just grabbed tools to start building these community efforts. And it was an amazing thing to see.
Yeah. And I think, people say that the best innovations come out of necessity, but you need to be able to grab the tools to be able to do that. So if those tools aren't available, if you don't have connectivity, or if you don't those underlying base, foundations, if you don't have those, and actually the very base level of digital literacy, you can't grab the tools that you need. And so you can't innovate the way that you need to. You find other people that maybe can, and you bring those together, but that's all about the community. And then the smart part, and whatever term we want to use, I know it's not the be all and end all, but I think is that we have those base and the foundation, and that we're willing to kind of learn and test and try, but also that we have been supplied, or we have that utility of connectivity and digital literacy. And I think that's a huge component of this. And it's not just, we know how to use technology, so we're going to go up and up and up, and we'll be working less for more money, and productivity goes crazy, et cetera, et cetera. But if we don't bring everyone along the journey, then what kind of world do we want? What kind of world are we actually developing? And I think touching on some of those nuances you were talking about earlier around smart city being this kind of term and to sell technology, actually grabbing that and shifting that and taking the good bits that we want to be able to move forward. And whether I don't necessarily mean to say good bits, but I mean the bits that can actually have positive change if we use them appropriately. So you're talking about smart city, and that's a very winded way of asking you a question about, you've stayed in the space of smart city, but obviously there's you don't want all of these bits of selling technology. What are these kind of common threads that you see really useful and positive in the original concept, or the one that now we've morphed into? So what are those threads that we can, I guess, kind of pull out and really embrace so we can build better communities in the future?
Oh man, where to start? Well, there's a couple places to start there. I mean, so one place, one thought, because I just wrote about this recently, for example, is like, we originally thought of the smart city in a lot of cases as like prestige premium real estate, and you put technology on top. Like, we were discussing before, and you were in Korea, Songdo, South Korea, archetypal smart city as sold as such, built from scratch on landfill and the Yellow Sea. And, and they, first Microsoft and Cisco built out the tech there. But really what's happened, at least in a North American context, is that starting with Uber over a decade ago and leading to like some of the 15-minute delivery quick commerce apps now, DoorDash and Gorillas and some of these other companies, really what they've done is built these tech stacks where they are all about monetizing marginal real estate and marginal pieces of the city. And of course, their various labor issues. So it's all about the dark store, which is like an abandoned retail storefront that gets turned into a micro fulfillment warehouse because they've collected data from elsewhere, these filaments of demand. And that leads to outcomes where, in their dream world, people never leave their homes again, a fully remote world. So I think that's interesting in the sense of like they built a whole tech stacks to basically help activate, or I would say, fracking, hydraulic fracking is my great metaphor of like how tech's doing this, like throwing money and data and stuff into this to flush out whatever value out of cities. That's what they've been doing. So one question is like, how do we turn that around? How do we basically use a civic tech stack to basically, to create more value there? And so I'm doing some work, for example, with my friends at the Global Partnership for Informal Transport. We're doing a project with UNDP, the UN Development Program, to study informal transport. This is, of course, all the mini buses and all sorts of ways that people get around the global south. One of the questions we're asking is like, is there ways to take those tech stacks and create public layers? Like India has a universal payments layer. Can we create other forms of booking and payment so that, entrepreneurs who are not getting billions of dollars of startup money can create their own versions of this? And so I'm still interested of like, if we can't invest the kinds of sums these big companies can we at least mandate that there should be public options so that people can roll their own versions of this? I think that's one powerful way of doing this. Like, how do we build a parallel public open source infrastructure? Second, one of the other big trends that comes out of this, and it's inspiring and worrisome to the same degree, is, Los Angeles and the Department of Transportation there, LADOT, as far as I know, they were the first city government to create their own software standard. They created the mobility data specifications, how they govern the scooters there and others. And, it requires those companies operating in LA to send data up to LADOT. And LADOT has the option, in theory, to send instructions back down to regulate them. It's gotten heavily criticized because LADOT wants the same kind of ultra granular data over real-time movement that the companies have. And many people have argued that the government shouldn't have that kind of power, which I go back and forth on. Like private companies get to have that power, but governments can't. But it is a question of like what forms of regulation will work? How does the government step in to protect the rights of the public realm and prevent these companies from running roughshod literally over this? And so I'll end my response here with like, Selena Reynolds of LADOT likes to say the code is the new concrete. So I'm curious about like, how does government working with communities create these new tools to administer the public realm and create new kinds of institutions to do so, whether that's community groups or otherwise. So I think of those two trends, like, all of these companies that are mining the public realm, and we haven't really developed the tools to figure out how to stop them from doing so in a way that assuages privacy and other things that we hold dear.
Yeah, totally. And then to be able to, I guess, allowing private companies to kind of, we're hacking the public realm like you were talking about, which is a really interesting way to think about it and to, I guess, to think about it. But also then from a government perspective, how do you do that in a positive way so you can deliver that benefit to the community? I love that. That's such an interesting way to kind of bring that together. I was thinking about, I did a fellowship where I traveled around and the informal transport, particularly in Mexico and Cape Town as well. And talking to a lot of entrepreneurs in Mexico about that very topic was very interesting because they realize that they can't just take away this service, even though it's unsafe, it's unregulated, because people must rely on this to get to their jobs, right? Which is kind of obvious, but it's also, particularly women are not safe on these minibus taxi things and that type of thing, lots of issues there. But it doesn't take a Western hat or a foreign hat to come in and go, oh, well, it's easy, just do this. That local context is so important. And I guess, like you were talking about, how do we then bring in the government or the public good to be able to actually do that in a way that's sustainable and as in economically sustainable, all the other things as well. But I think that's one of the big things that we don't talk about enough. You can do a small pilot and, you can prove that it works. but then somebody is relying on that service then to get to work. If it doesn't show up the next day because the pilot's over, we've failed. And not in a fail of, fail and try again. It's like, well, actually we've built up this expectation. We've changed the way people are doing things. But if we don't continue that service and be able to scale that so they can use that, then we've actually left them probably worse off than before, because they had a service before it wasn't the best, but we've, increased that and then we've taken everything away. And I think that happens a lot, particularly in regional rural areas where it's not as sexy. There's not as much limelight on it, these type of things as well. And I think for me, shifting that conversation to those conversations, and I find them very interesting. And most people, I guess, when we're thinking about big challenges and big complex things, we want to be able to make them economically sustainable. So you have to have this economic argument. Unfortunately, it's all well and good to have, that it is for public good and those type of things. But at the end of the day, like you were talking about, touched on briefly, the capitalism, that's the world we live in. But how do we use that to the advantage of the people that don't have access now? And how do we bring them into the conversation, but then bring the other side where you need to continue to build and shape this? Because otherwise, again, we're going to end up in that world that we were talking about, where private companies are fracking the public realm and the governments get left behind. And I think we're in a very interesting world now where obviously we've had the pandemic, is still happening. But as we come out of that, what decisions are going to be different, and how are we going to trust differently between public and private and all those type of things as well. So I think it's a really interesting, potentially not in a super positive way, but hopefully we can shift it that way. Interesting time to have these conversations and see what action's going to come out of it.
Well, there's a couple of things there. I mean, one, I think of the fact that so with regards to comes back to smart communities. I mean, so one thing, instead of having the big platforms, and I look at DoorDash as an example of this. DoorDash started out obviously will be a service that connects local restaurants and delivers meals to you. Well, DoorDash in the States now is basically creating its own verticalized platform. They're creating their own kitchens. They're partnering with brands. They're gonna push out their own local partners at some point. They just use them as a booster rocket to whatever they think will be profitable. So we can already see them discarding community there. So there's that. And so therefore, I think it's interesting that the most interesting stuff in that space is we should be encouraging people to build tools to arm the local businesses, because the answer is not to just put a finger in the dike, so to speak, and in the Dutch parable, and try to keep the water out. To quote Shopify, the Canadian giant, arm the rebels, give them tools to do that. So there's that aspect. The second one I think too is my friend Anthony Townsend wrote a great book, Ghost Road, about sort of applications of autonomous vehicles or thinking it through. And he pointed out in the early 20th century, again in the States, some of the first monopolies were localized electric transport and power monopolies. In Seattle, the electric trams and the utilities joined and they created what was called traction monopolies. And it was only after the government created its own public sector utility alternative did they finally break the hold of that. And I started to think about, and you raised this point explicitly, and I think about it too, what does sort of the future public utilities of smart cities look like? How do we create a utility model where fine, you could have your profits, we'll do the business model for you, and in exchange, you provide public goods. I'm going to London this week with my son for his spring break. And in the past, I visited for Transport for London, the world's arguably best transit agency or most powered thinker. And I love the fact that all the iconic buses, they're all private tenders, but their losses are backstopped in exchange for consolidated control by TfL itself and routes and everything else there. We have to create new kind of structures for that, for these sort of digital partners. And there's some interesting examples. Via, for example, redesigned the New York City school bus network using their technology. They want to partner with cities to help them remap it. They've gotten rid of their private ride sharing service. We need a lot more like that, of these companies to provide services to governments under procurement contracts and then allow people to sort of work with those tools. And we haven't really gotten there yet. No one understands what that's like there to figure out how to make those play. And it's a hard thing, right? The entire logic of startups is scale and disrupt, or disrupt and scale, I guess, and try to get oligopoly-like profits. We've got to break free of that mold. Otherwise, the smart cities paradigm is going to continue to bind us.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think no one knows how to do that, or we're working towards that. But I think there's a yet in there, because I think particularly in this space, it's that's not possible. We can't think like that or whatever. That kind of happened with technology. And now I think having more people in this space, more brains in this space, which is why I like to have so many people on the podcast, as in different people, and bringing those things in, picking up those little things from each of those. And then we've got enough of that kind of power that we can, and not power in the sense of, big tech companies, but enough power that is working towards that public good in a way that makes sense. I think we can actually shift that conversation forward and be able to shift that, because I think we don't really have another choice for the future of our communities. And I think one of the most powerful things is in the last, I guess, and you've been in the space longer than me as well, but in the last 5 years, what I've seen is smart cities is not this separate thing, or it used to be this, separate thing, like you were talking about, a physical thing where it's premium real estate with tech on top. I never saw it like that. I mean, that's how I learned about it when I was first in Korea, but even then they were having conversations about people and services and better services from government, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're kind of shifting to go, well, actually, it's not this separate thing. It has to be built into everything that we're doing, and not in a way that tech takes over everything. But the fact is, tech is in all of our lives, whether we use a computer or not, because all of these things are underlying, the services that we have, the things that are available, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can't shy away from that. But we need to have governments more empowered with people that have this mindset of not just, tech, and, oh, isn't it amazing that we can do this, that, or the other? Critically analyzing what it is and what it isn't, and what it's good and what is good about it and what is bad about it, the privacy and the not, and what access we need and what we don't, all those type of things. I think that's the really interesting conversations that it's probably, we should have been having them yesterday, but we're starting those conversations now. And I think that will be that richness that we need to then empower these smart communities in the future to actually make them a reality, not just some wild utopia thing, which is, the conversations I used to have back in the day. That's what people thought about. But actually also bringing the community in as well, because they'll give us a real reality check. It's just like, yeah, we can all talk about this as professionals and working in this space, but unless you can explain it to somebody that's walking down the street and it makes sense to them, and they're like, oh, that I want to get involved in that. That sounds good, or that sounds that could benefit my life or my family or whoever, then we haven't actually succeeded yet. So I think that will be a really interesting conversation in the future as well, or building to that future as well.
Well, absolutely. I mean, this is where, I don't think we can have a podcast about smart cities without invoking Sidewalk Toronto, but let's bring it up here because, you alluded to, in terms of like government ability. So Bianca Wiley, of course, who really led the resistance or catalyzed the resistance to that project, Bianca's made the larger point that like the villain in that story wasn't ultimately Sidewalk Toronto or Sidewalk Labs. It was Waterfront Toronto, the public agency that completely abdicated its responsibility to write the RFP of what it really wanted and what capabilities it needed from vendors, and instead told the vendor to write the RFP. And really Bianca's point, and I totally agree, is it just shows like the lack of imagination and faith in their own abilities by government. It just shows the bottomless lack of capability of government officials to trust in their own judgment and assert their own vision for this. And instead, and again, this is like sort of the totalizing power of startups and IT and tech, which is like tech is good and anything allows us to be good. The problem, the ultimate problem with Sidewalk Toronto is that it basically was premised that it allowed Justin Trudeau to have a handshake moment with Eric Schmidt, the chairman of Google. That's when the troubles began. The other part of that, which I think is also going to be hard in this entire thing, is that every business model when it comes down to smart cities is about surveillance. It's about just data collection. And even if you don't know what your business model is, like Sidewalk Toronto never truly landed on what its business model was, the ultimate answer is like, we'll just collect the data and opportunities will present themselves further down the road. In that regard, it's sort of like the way intelligence agencies collect data, figuring out like, we'll crack the encryption later and find out what we need to find out. I'm furthering afield here, but that's sort of a core tension in this too. How do we get away from surveillance as like a core thing of this, where like just basically harvest all the data exhaust you possibly can, and then we'll find a way to profit on it. And until governments basically mandate that cannot be the business model, or we're going to put in protections in place that it's not about that data exhaust, or you only collect much more anodyne data exhaust that allows you to do some planning but is much more privatized. Yeah, I mean that's sort of like the key breakthrough for this. And I don't know, there's a lot of discuss there, but like the most interesting smart city project to me right now, or smart community, is sort of like, Dan Hill, who has made many stops. He was at Arup, he was at Citra in Finland, and Vinnova right now in Sweden, and now he's going to the University of Melbourne, which is why it's worth mentioning here, headed back to Australia. He conceptualized various smart city projects that would, not have that level of data collection, but would like empower local residents. So I bring this up. His last project was the 1 Minute City in Sweden, where they are creating a kit of parts, a sort of open source software for the city to allow residents to basically build out, wooden temporary lightweight forms of infrastructure for scooter parking or for other uses as part of the post-pandemic 15-minute city approach. And that's a collection of like, basically using a map of the city and standardized parking spaces to provide tools to people to remake their city. And then I'm not even sure how much data they would collect back on this, but it was very much a whole like, let's give people the tools to remake their environment. And that's, I think, more of the projects we need to see, like how to, governments putting tools in the hands of users versus like, let's collect a ton of data here and then we'll try to remake the urban environment.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's, for me in the data space, like I read this really great article. I can't remember where it was and I need to find it because I keep talking about it, but I don't think I've ever shared the link for it. But it was like, it shouldn't be what does the city know about me? It's what information can I, as a resident, understand about the city, and then I can make decisions with that information. And I think that's where the data element comes in. There's still mass amounts of data, but actually you don't need to know that I go from this address to this address. You need to potentially know that there's a large amount of people, so then we can, shift the sidewalk or whatever the case may be. That's a ridiculous example, but so many other things like that. But it's actually, we need to shift our mindset in that it's not what can I know about the resident, but what does the resident need to know about the city so they can make better, not even better decisions, but richer decisions, more powerful decisions for them to increase their quality of life, not to make it easier for the government. Make it easier for the government to provide the services that they need. But again, it's thinking back to the person who's trying to get around the city, access services, get their kids to school, access, accommodation, employment, etc. Bring that customer to the center. And I know that's a bit of nearly a buzzword, you know what I mean? But actually, when you start thinking like that, you have to have different conversations, particularly if you're working with council or you work in council or government. And it's a completely different shift, and it's a governance change. It's all these things and policy and all these type of things, which are all the things that aren't so sexy that have to happen after it. Otherwise, we just cannot shift how we want to shift or how we must shift to be able to create these communities that aren't disempowered, that aren't disengaged, that can trust the government or the other people that are providing services, etc. And also improve quality of life, because ultimately that's what it's for, right? And I think, it's a really interesting flip. And when you do that, some things might seem like they're not shifting or changing, but over time we can really make a massive difference and a massive impact. And I think it takes more people to be involved in this to understand, and then to be able to speak the language of the community so they understand why this is how it is. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people don't know what a government does, and they're not interested because they have so much on their plate already of trying to live life. So we have to make it really easy for them and speak their language, not because they're less than, we're just not using the right language or the right channels or the right tools. And I think if we kind of start to flip it like that, then I think we'll have very different conversations, and we'll be able to have better conversations and start better projects and finish better projects, and that continues to weave through everything we do, not just have this separate, this is where all the smart stuff happens over here, because it doesn't work. It can't work like that.
No, totally. I mean, there's obviously sort of many reasons why it works that way today. I mean, the entire Silicon Valley logic is like, just flatten the landscape, who cares what they actually need? Here's what we've got. And, we'll get enough people to use it as it is that we'll be able to start remaking the landscape. And if that all else fails, sending the lobbyists and lawyers, as Uber and all the other tech companies have learned when it comes to dealing with government. But I guess to offer a hopeful vision at the end, I mean, you're totally right in the sense of being able to offer to people. The most inspiring vision of a smart community that I read recently was, I can't remember the title of it, but it was a Cory Doctorow short story that he wrote for The Atlantic. But it was basically imagining a block party in Los Angeles in the 2030s where enough residents group voted together that it sort of triggered a participatory budgeting routine where they got some resources from the city, like temporary things were brought in and they were able to set up a block party. And I guess it points to the agenda I'm interested in from a smart community standpoint is how do you create better and democratic decision-making tools, so allowing sort of group voting on things. I mean, for just as a minor example, we saw during the pandemic that virtual community board meetings are probably more equitable than in-person ones because it gets at least slightly more participation by people who can't physically be there. But of course, the problem there is still who's privileged enough to have evenings off to go do that. And then second, I think participatory budgeting and tying that into virtual tools, creating more crowdfunding tools to allow the allocation of resources of this, I think would be really powerful. And again, trying to tie this back together to volunteering and sort of offering this. I say the vision, one of the visions that sticks with me, to mention Dan Hill again, and also my friend Brian Boyer, who worked on it, was like, 6 or 7 years ago, they coined the idea of Brickstarter, like a Kickstarter for the built environment, which wasn't just crowdfunding, but also like figuring out like who had to attend what meetings to get approvals, and then allowing people to sort of sign up for shifts, creating a sort of collectivized version of like who would help shepherd this through forms of government. And the problem that Dan has identified is still the problem that's with us, which is like what he called dark matter, all the internal processes of how things get done. It's just really hard for people to understand that from the outside. And a lot of agencies aren't really interested in like to making that more legible, to exactly your point. So there's a whole big project to be done about like that, like middleware, right? Out of the whole software industry comes the idea of middleware, of translation between people and government or even private entities, and like writing that middleware that allows you to match up your needs and wants with like how processes work. Still like just crying out for that.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think like I love working with government because they have such a complex job, right? And they can't disengage from the market, and they can't even choose their customers, right? So it's a hard job and it's a complex job. So we need passionate people in there. We need talented people in there. And we do have those, but they need to be empowered to be able to then grab the tools that they need or develop the tools that they need and work with the partners that they need to be able to shift this conversation forward. Now, I'm just looking at the time. We go to the future, but I just want to quickly, do you have any projects that you want to touch on specifically? We've talked about a few already, and then we can share the links or any information on those in the show notes as well.
Yeah, I work on a couple projects relative to this. Nothing, I don't know if I can point to anything per se, but yeah, I alluded to one, this project with GPIT that we're doing for UNDP. And there, yeah, we're looking at sort of the landscape of informal mobility. And it's a really fascinating time because a lot of the academic literature, a lot of the NGOs that cover it are trailing behind what's happening on the ground. You look at what's coming out of like Southeast Asia, the so-called super apps like Gojek and Grab and Ola, and like they started as informal transport, but they built these digital wallets and now they're horizontally expanding in all these industries. And that creates really interesting, regulatory hurdles and other stuff. But that model is now trying to come to the global north or the very global south in the case of Australia. So it's interesting to pay attention to that. And then the other project I'm working on with MIT's Future Urban Collectives Lab, we just got a grant from the Center for Advanced Urbanism. And yeah, we're basically we're partnering with the disco folks out of Spain to sort of think about like, how do you create tech collective overlay to allow people, to reward people for various contributions. So this is the idea like out of Web3 and crypto of like, you can issue tokens for various forms of work. Is there ways that you can create forms of compensation for like work that is otherwise invisible, forms of care and things? It's sort of a double-edged sword. Like, do you really want to financialize every encounter in the world? But maybe you do. Maybe you do want to create ways of taking invisible, unrewarded work and visualize it. So that's sort of a conceptual project we're doing, and we're hoping to find some local partners in Baltimore, where both organizations have contacts, to sort of figure that out of like, can we create this new digital overlay on top of communities? And then finally, I've got another project with my friend Brandon Klein, who has a long career in collaboration, and he created the world's second legally incorporated decentralized autonomous organization, or DAO, to run a co-working space in Minneapolis. We're trying to figure out a successor org which is similar. Like, how do you create new forms of organizing people around areas of interest that has fundraising mechanisms, but also democratic forms of governance? And to say the least, the DAOs that are out there have problems. So we're trying to see if we can fix those and move forward. But I think there's some really interesting ideas, at least in the Web3 movement, even if their implementation has been dubious to say the least. But for following me, I'd send listeners to my personal website, which is greglindsay.org. I'm also available on LinkedIn. You can find me, and I'm out there, spewing opinions on Twitter as well at greg._Lindsay if you want to come see that. But you can find me. I'm around.
Excellent. Now let's zoom to the future now. And what are the emerging trends that people aren't talking about enough?
Oh man, that's a good question. They're talking too much about crypto. That is for sure. Way, way too much about the metaverse. And I guess, trend that people aren't talking about enough. So this is another area of interest for me that I've been talking to the LADOT folks about and others. I would love to get listeners interested in this. So, the metaverse gets talked about like, Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook, like we're all going to wear VR headsets for 10 hours a day. But the other form of the metaverse is the augmented reality kind. Snap and Apple supposedly working on new forms of augmented glasses to overlay information on reality. We need to think very long, hard, and fast about what that means, because we're imminently approaching a place where literally people will be living in alternate realities. The person walking towards you down the street might be in a Harry Potter universe, multiverse, metaverse, while someone might be an Avengers one. How can governments establish baseline reality so that people aren't running into the street like they did with Pokemon Go 6 years ago? And, there were all sorts of pedestrian fatalities. So we need to think very quickly about are we creating the final technology to separate us, to plunge us all into individual realities? And how do we ensure that there's at least a baseline level of technologically mediated reality that we're still in? So that's something we need to pay attention to. It's very easy to laugh at Mark Zuckerberg, and when he's managed to wipe out half their market cap in a matter of weeks, you can do that. But yeah, I think it's a very potentially dangerous technology, maybe a very powerful one too. But we've got to move quickly, more quickly than we did with Uber, and the last decade of companies that set out to disrupt the public sphere.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one. And I think, even just living in a digital world as well, like going into a world where you're still sitting at a computer, but you can buy property and you can do all these things through crypto and that type of stuff. And it's interesting, and just I think people are starting to get a bit curious about it, and the general population is starting to get curious about it, which is where I think we need to move fast to understand it from a technical sense, but then also that, the reality, it's a new form of reality, which I think is really interesting as well. And what does it mean for our cities when they're also digital? There's a digital version, or there's new cities, but they're all digital, but I can buy property in there and I can make money from that as well. So I think it will be interesting to see where it heads. And also what governments need to think about. There's some things they probably don't need to think about, but there's things that maybe aren't so obvious that they really could think about as well. And do they offer services now in the metaverse, in 10 years' time or whatever? And what do they need to do now to be able to do that? Is the level of literacy going to be there? Digital literacy going to be there? Is there, there's so many things that's going to be really interesting. And also thinking about some of the, the movies that we watch, you can kind of pick up, is that the future that we want? And so if we don't want that, what things do we need to do now to actually shift and change that? Or is that, actually we want, and you were talking about earlier, it's not good or bad, but we can pick the things out that we need. And I think that's where, this polarization doesn't help us in the world we live in at the moment, or today, or have for a while, because we can't actually pick out the things that worked well or didn't, or that if we shifted just, a little bit to the right, that could actually work quite well, or a bit to the left, those things could work. So I think that's really interesting. I think it will be in the next couple of years or so. At the moment, it's a buzzword, but what are the real things that can fall out of that as well? Because I think there's smart city was the buzzword, digital twin was the buzzword, blockchain, whatever. But what are those things that actually could be real out of that as well will be interesting to see.
No, absolutely. I would say two things there just to build on that quickly before we wrap. The government of Barbados is already creating a virtual embassy in the metaverse through Decentraland, and they intend to offer consular services there, which speaks to, in a way, I think the overall point, which is, of course, economic inequality that hovers over all of this, because, extremely empowered, tech literate individuals who are often Web3 are creating these places. I learned just today of a DAO called Cabin, where they're building a decentralized city. Basically, just an archipelago of real estate. And you're going to see that whole thing happen as well. Very privileged individuals creating access or membership to privileged, fortified areas. And we could have an entirely separate conversation about how climate change factors in this as well. And really, I think one frontier of the smart city is building out the entire sensing apparatus and public modeling, so that people understand the risks of where they are. Because again, throw this out big before we go, but people, in the United States, people have moved towards climate risk zones over the last decade, and especially during the pandemic, Florida, Texas, places where housing are cheap. And a lot of the models that have been built to understand that are in private hands, to basically for, in real estate investors and other ones. So there's a whole project to be done there about building public climate models and public smart cities and warning systems to help people understand what those risks are as well. So I think that should be on our agenda of what smart communities should be, ones that are resilient and safer and where people understand those risks.
It's been really great to chat with you, Greg. Thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I just have one last question, which is how can people connect with you?
Now, like I said, so you can find me, again, Twitter, LinkedIn, my personal website at greglindsay.org. I speak and write and do things freely. So please feel free to get in touch if you like what you've heard and want to hear more anytime. Excellent. We'll put all the links in the show notes. And I'd like to have another conversation. Maybe we can see what else is happening in 2022 and pick up on some of those things. So I think we're going to see lots of shifts, lots of changes, and it'd be really interesting to follow along your work as well. So thanks for coming onto the podcast. Thanks for having me. We'll talk soon. Bye-bye. Bye.
The Smart Community podcast is brought to you by My Smart Community. If you're looking for support in podcast strategy and production, workshop design and facilitation, or communication and media advisory, get in touch. Email hello@mysmart.community or head to www.mysmart.community.
Thanks so much for listening to the Smart Community Podcast. Show notes for this episode and all other episodes are available on our website, mysmart.community/podcast. If you have any questions for us or any of our guests, you can email hello@mysmart.community. You can also find us on the socials. We are on LinkedIn and Twitter @SmartComHQ. That's com with 2 M's. If you are enjoying the podcast, please hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. And we would love for you to leave us a rating and review at wherever you listen. This really helps us reach more ears and eyes, so thank you for your support. As always, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed making it.
The Smart Community Podcast is what you're looking for.